I think everyone needs a coach. I mean, mentorship and guidance have been incredibly crucial in our development as a company. So I thought I'd introduce you to some amazing coaches as part of this special series of Meet My Business. So on today's episode of Meet My Business, I have the great pleasure to introduce you to Erik Vermeulen. He helps leaders catalyze their people, teams, and culture to be more effective and more profitable. So this is typically our coaching edition of Meet My Business, although Erik doesn't quite brand himself as a coach. However, he has a massive amounts of experience in the leadership, development space, and I think he's got some incredible insights that he's going to share with us today. Erik, thank you so much for taking the time to join us.
Oh, thanks so much for the invitation and for having me on board. It's going to be a good afternoon.
Awesome. Really excited to get into what Erik calls the trust equation, how to build trust with your audience and market and why that's so incredibly important. But before we get to that, I think it's time, Erik, for you to maybe just introduce yourself a little bit, give us a bit of background on who you are and kind of what you do.
Thank you very much, Ethan. Yeah, I've been in the consulting space since 1999, which is virtually a lifetime. I think it's like 24 years at the moment, but I've stopped counting because I'm just getting grayer by the day. I can't get any more grey. But I think what kind of sets what I do apart from a lot of the other folks in the space is I have this unique combination of experiencing two very diverse fields. One being the management consulting field, where, as I say, I've been involved in since 1999. And in that space, doing a lot of work around culture development, leadership, and what I call behavioral strategies. In other words, how can we influence what our customers think, what our customers feel, what our employees think and feel by adopting and adapting the behaviors that we exhibit? You know, so often from a corporate perspective, we find that corporates tend to break trust because there's little alignment between what marketing says they do and what they actually do. And so I spend a lot of time aligning marketing with HR so that the company actually behaves in the way that marketing says it behaves. And the second area that I gather a lot of insights from and that I marry with my management consulting experience is that of an adventure and expedition leader. So I'm owner of an expedition business called Explore, and we lead expeditions to some of the 7 summits. We walk to the South Pole, we ride our mountain bikes across Tibet. And, you know, that in itself has a unique set of challenges and requirements from me as a leader and from what we need to do very quickly in terms of building a team, because, you know, going to mountains and altitude, if you get that wrong, that could absolutely kill you. And I've got the great distinction of having, throughout the 20-odd years of doing that, bringing everyone home alive with all their fingers and all their toes, to which their families, I'm sure, are pretty grateful. So in a nutshell, that's what I do, and the two worlds that I marry in the insights that I provide.
How did you get into the world of being an expedition leader? I genuinely have no idea how someone decides this is the company I'm going to start.
Yeah, I'm not really sure how I got into that as well, other than just fluke. No, look, you know, I had a real interest in adventures and expeditions from high school days. And I remember in high school already planning trips to Nepal and Annapurna and that sort of thing. But then it kind of culminated in a fairly fortuitous meeting with a South African adventurer, Alex Harris. And we were both on the speaking circuit. Well, we were still both on the speaking circuit, but we were speaking at the same conference. And I'd finished my slot early. I was the opening speaker. And the organizers asked me if I wouldn't mind fetching somebody at the airport, which is kind of unusual. But I kind of said, well, yeah, sure, you know, because I'm sitting around doing nothing. Popped round to the airport, and the speaker that I was picking up was Alex Harris. And he'd just returned from the South Pole. So, you know, we'd known of each other, but never really met. And that kind of led to us starting a friendship and getting Explore off the ground. Alex has since moved on from Explore. But, you know, that's how I got into it.
It really sounds like a super fascinating world. What I'm really curious about is, so some of the experiences that you've had there, like how do they directly correlate to the work that you do with businesses? What does climbing a mountain have to do with running a company?
I think there are huge correlations, particularly in terms of, you know, when you're running a company, The company stuff, if I can call it that, the balance sheets, that kind of stuff is really easy to manage. It's the people piece that becomes so intricate and so difficult. And, we find that companies, if you look at businesses that fail, and, the statistics around entrepreneurship is staggering, the number of businesses that don't make it past 5 years. And often that's not because of balance sheets, distribution, the kind of technical things. It's more often around the people thing. And what we find in many businesses that fail, or as I say, lose their flavor, it's not because of the product. It's because of the people who interact with the market. So I use an analogy that I call cordialism, where an empty glass, is the structure that allows you to do business. So to that, you then add the cordial, which is the flavor. It's the problem that your business solves in the market. And that's not palatable either. It's too sweet. You can't drink it. You can't sell it. So you add an element called brand. You add the people element. You add the other things that make a business, and that's akin to adding water to that cordial. Now, every business on the planet, I firmly believe, gets that right at some point. The perfect mix between cordial and water, the brand, the service, the product, and that allows them to be successful. But that leads to their downfall, because the more successful you become, the more people want your product, your business, your service, whatever it is. And so what do? You now add more people to make that happen. But the people that you add all have different values, different goals, different objectives. And so the distance between you as the founder of the business and the people who work in the business and the results that you generate gets bigger and bigger and bigger. And if you keep adding water to the cordial, what happens to your flavor? Sooner or later, it gets diluted and becomes bland, and it becomes just like everybody else. And the customers that used to love us now hate us. And that's exactly what happens on mountains. We get a group of people who often are strangers. We meet them 2 or 3 times before each expedition, often only online. And then we meet in Mendoza, for argument's sake, on day 1. Day 2, we leave to climb a 7,000-meter high mountain. And instantly, I've got to find ways to get the team to work together, to align goals, to align strategy, to manage conflict, to manage expectations. And so, the stuff that we do to be successful on mountains absolutely just transfers directly into the people elements and the stuff that we need to be successful in business. If you think of managing change, for example, climbing high mountains, there's this constant sense of change. You've got to watch the weather all the time. You've got to watch everybody's health. You've got to monitor everybody's progress. And things will change in a heartbeat. And I remember in 2016 on Aconcagua, we had everyone set. We were ready to start our summit, but this crazy storm came through the mountain and they shut the mountain down. 2 of our tents were blown out of Camp 1. We lost gear. We lost food. And now, how do we regroup? How do we keep the team motivated? How do we deal with losing people who leave the expedition? And how do we deal with this whole idea of goal setting, which often becomes, for me, a real red herring in life, in business? Because if we become too focused on a goal and we're not worried about the process, or we're not concerned about how we achieve the goal, we set ourselves up for ethical issues, for fraud. On mountains, that kind of stuff kills you. So it's around understanding the process and making that the goal in itself. Because on mountains, if you're putting so much gravity into standing on a particular piece of this planet, sooner or later, you're going to make a really bad decision and it's going to cost you your life. But if you're focused on the process and you find purpose in that process and not in the outcome, it means that when people come to mountains with us and they don't summit or we don't summit, which sometimes happens, and you're not you're invested in the process, it means that you now have the opportunity to leave the mountain undefeated, having learned something and willing to come back to the same place in the future. Whereas if you're only invested in the outcome, we've had that incident. We had a guy in 2020, January, just before COVID, on a big mountain with us. And he was so vested in the outcome that he started fighting with me and the rest of the team about the process, to the point where I wasn't budging on the process because I firmly believe in it. And he left our expedition. He got someone else to guide him. And I saw him about a week or so later after leaving our expedition. He had full-blown pulmonary edema. He was on death's door, helicopter evacuation off the mountain. Sometimes you just have to respect the process, because when you respect the process and the process is right, that leads to crazy amounts of success later on. And it allows you to kind of keep your ethics and your integrity intact.
For me right now, what's very fascinating is where we are in our company is, I think we're like 95% cordial still at this point. We've been growing the company slowly but surely, and we're at the point now where we're getting people on board, we're getting team members bit by bit, the very early days of that. And we're also really thinking a lot about our processes. We know what our goals are, it's mostly sales targets, but process-wise, all of that stuff has to get in place. And I think there's a lot of small businesses out there who are kind of in that same situation where they are either single founder, co-founder, solopreneurs who are then eventually wanting to become a real business and not just creating work for themselves. So, you've got to start putting water in the cordial, right? For companies in that stage who are starting to get more people on board, how do you make sure that things align properly? How do you make sure that you actually kind of make the right decisions? And maybe just some broad advice that you might have for companies at that stage?
Yeah, certainly. I think the key in setting yourself up for scaling and growth is putting in place from the outset a really solid set of values and a really solid culture. People work for companies that they not only like and admire, but in a broader sense, in the good old days where jobs were plentiful and you could choose where you wanted to work, there's a lot of research that shows that employees did really well in companies whose values matched their own values. It means that employees can come to work in a fully congruent state, and they don't feel that they have to be someone else or pretend in order to fit in at work. So if you, as a business, start off creating a solid platform with really powerful values, and by that I don't mean corporate goals. I was intrigued a couple of years ago doing a lot of work for one of the major banks in South Africa, and their top line value is delivering shareholder values, something along those lines. And it's the very first thing that's written on their sheet of business values. Now, the question, I suppose, is, and that poster, by the way, was stuck also in the inside of the security hut for the guard at the front gate. Now, how does the value of delivering shareholder value, how does that translate into behavior for the security guard? We can understand how that might translate for someone in middle or senior management. But the problem lies in what a lot of companies are doing in terms of values, and that's saying, well, let's look at what we want to achieve and disguise that as a value to drive behavior. Whereas really, powerful values, true values, are filters for decision-making. All companies have values, and then they choose to write them on the wall at reception or stick them on the poster in the security guard hat. But as a family, I bet you also have values. But if I come to visit you at home and I walk through your front door, I can tell you now your family values aren't written on the wall by the front door. And the reason they're not written there is because they are not only intrinsic, but they are lived and experienced. And when you don't live them, there's an experience or a consequence attached to that as well. Do yourself a favor and go and Google Enron values. For the younger folk around, Enron was like the poster child of corporate fraud and the illegality in the US probably about 15 years ago. But if you go and look at their values look really sound. Things like teamwork, integrity, but they practice the exact opposite. So the first thing is to then, as you're about to scale your business, make sure your values are really strong, really powerful. And secondly, then how does that translate into the behaviors that describe your culture? And culture really isn't owned by marketing or by HR, but it's essentially around the behaviors that are tolerated, accepted, and not sanctioned within your business. So by having strong values and a really strong culture defined by behaviors, it makes it very difficult for people who don't really fit into your business to fit into your business, if that makes sense. One of the really amazing stories, and there's a book that if you haven't read it, you've got to read it. It's called Delivering Happiness by a guy named Tony Hsieh. And Tony Hsieh invested in a company called Zappos.com, an online shoe store that was eventually bought out by Amazon for hundreds of millions of dollars. But when Tony started as an investor and then took over as CEO of Zappos, one of the first things that they did was they had a look at how they recruited. And they recruited to fit culture, not the other way around. And I think that's where a lot of small businesses go wrong, is we haven't got our recruitment process properly refined. And we recruit more on gut feel and CV rather than on culture fit. So what Zappos and Tony Hsieh and them did was, firstly, no matter what your new position was, even if you were the new CFO, you started your first month in the call center, which is the absolute heart of an online business. And that allowed a couple of things to happen. Firstly, for other staff to experience the new hire. Secondly, for the new hire to really experience the culture. Thirdly, for the new hire to understand that being customer-centric is what the business is all about. And then the second thing that Zappos did is, if somebody within their first 4 months, I think it was, chose to leave because they didn't like it there, or they didn't fit in, or they didn't think the job was what they thought it would be, they would pay them a 3-month severance package. And it means that if someone didn't feel entirely comfortable, didn't really fit in, they weren't forced to stay there because they needed the job and they needed the money. And, these two things are really powerful in employing people and keeping that flavor of your business, keeping that cordialism intact, so that, the reasons people work there don't become too far from the founder members and the original ethos of the business. Because, ultimately, people who come and work for you for their reasons, not your reasons.
That is genuinely such interesting advice. And we've been, as a company, working on our values, putting them in place. But I think we have to spend more time on this, genuinely, myself and my co-founder, to really make sure that everybody is aligned, and how we communicate that as well. And as you said, not just have it be a post on a wall, but actually something we live. So we're going to move on to the final discussion of today's episode, and specifically around trust. Trust with your audience and market is incredibly important for companies, because without it, people just physically will not feel comfortable buying from you. And I'm assuming many other issues can occur. But I know that you have formulated kind of a way to think about this called the trust equation. So can you maybe just walk us through that?
Yeah, absolutely. And, the more I work with this trust equation, and the more companies kind of experience it and we talk about it, I think the broader the applications for this become. I think for the initial part, we all understand, or we're starting to understand, how important trust really is. But trust, because it's a feeling, is often very difficult to define. One of the exercises I often do with my audiences in live sessions, when we talk about irrational feelings and decisions, is around asking someone in the audience, someone who's married or in a committed relationship, I ask them, what are the 3 things, the 3 characteristics that you saw in your life partner that allowed you to say, yes, this is Mr. or Miss Right? And the first thing I find is that people find that very difficult to define. So, so what are those 3 things that attracted you to your husband or your wife? And they find that difficult. Secondly, when they then actually can put their finger on 3 things, Those three attributes are very, very generic. And I find that across the board, there's probably no more than 5 or 6 attributes that are assigned to significant others. So once they tell me that, I then say to them, okay, so is there anybody else in your friendship circle at that time where you met your significant other that had the same qualities? And every single time they admit that, yes, there were other people who were kind and good looking and had ticked all those boxes. So then the next question is, then why did you choose this person? And the truth of the matter is no one knows, because falling in love is an irrational decision. But we justify it after the fact when people say to us, oh, Ethan, so why did you fall for Ethan? And so then we justify it. Trust is exactly the same. Unless we codify it, we kind of go by gut feel. And we say, well, I kind of like this person because of how they dress, what their website looks like, how they answer emails. But you can't really put your finger on it. So let's codify it and look at what are the attributes that allow us to build trust or break trust with our market, with our employees, with our customers. And the first part of the trust equation is what we call credibility. And credibility really is this idea of what the brand's words are, or your words, and how believable they seem. I attended a business networking function on last week, recently, and the speaker was relatively charismatic, made a good point to tell the audience about how wealthy they are, how they take trips overseas, how they're investing in property overseas, how they own a Ferrari. But his shoes were old, cheap, and dirty. So there's this lack of congruence between the words and the image. So when we look at this first aspect of credibility, it's around how competent and capable you seem. People ask themselves, I can trust you to say what you say about. And it's about how much you know, your credentials, confidence, what you inspire in others. So my brand with Ridgeline, I've been consulting since 1999. That's 24 years. I've been guiding expeditions for 20 years. We've brought people back with all the figures, all their toes and alive. That builds credibility. So to build your own credibility is, how can you share your experience, your knowledge? How can you be transparent about what you know and what you don't know? So many people who enter a market initially pretend to know everything, and they feel that by not knowing something, they show vulnerability. And, if you look at leadership research, vulnerability builds credibility in a massive way from a leadership perspective. So the first aspect is credibility. The second aspect is reliability. And this is around your actions and how dependable you seem. Reliability says, if I say I'm going to do something, then I do it. It's around your audience saying, I can trust you to do what you say you do when you say you're going to do it. Are you consistent in your track record? Does your audience have a common frame of reference with you and the shared understanding? So we build reliability by making and keeping lots of small promises to build a track record. Well, one of my sort of key tests when kind of testing somebody in terms of trust and reliability is around small things like, someone says, I'll phone you back. How often do you actually phone somebody back? And my sort of golden rule on that is, when you verbalize intent, you've made a commitment. And I think sometimes we're just too quick, too easy, too fast to verbalize intent. I'll phone you back. I'll respond to your email. Let me think about it. And then, of course, you never do. And lots of small failures in reliability tends to break down trust in a very big way. So if you think of the trust equation as a division sum, above the line, you've got credibility plus reliability plus the third one, intimacy. And that's got nothing to do with what happens after dark or during load shedding, right? But intimacy literally around your emotions and how safe people feel sharing with you, how close you are to your customers, how easily accessible you are to your market. About a year ago, my Facebook account was hacked and I was locked out of it for probably about 4 or 5 months. I'd given up on it. And March this year, I thought, well, let me give it another shot to get back in, which oddly, remarkably suddenly worked. The problem, though, is that the hackers had run up a $500 ad account on my Facebook network. Do you think I can speak to anybody at Facebook to try and figure out how to get rid of that debt or sort it out or move past it? It's completely impossible. Facebook scores a massive 0 on intimacy. It's completely impossible to get hold of anybody. And so we build intimacy by creating a higher level of emotional security around us, levels of empathy, for example. We build it by demonstrating vulnerability, by reacting to emotions behind what's being said when we communicate with our market, with our customers. And the bigger the intimacy we build, the more trusted we are as a brand. And so above the line, you've got credibility, reliability, and intimacy. All of this is then divided by the denominator, which sits below the line, which we call self-orientation. Now, we've all met people that when you speak to them, when we interact with them, everything is just all about themselves. High orientation is very high, or self-orientation is very high. And self-orientation is around your motives and focus on yourself versus others. And the reason self-orientation is the denominator is that people or companies with a very high self-orientation find it really difficult to score high on the trust equation. Because if it's all about me, if you're my customer, you're not really trusting me. So I can trust and care. I can trust you to care about me, my products, etc. High self-orientation results in low trustworthiness. And it's important that we make that distinction as well. And so high self-orientation manifests as selfishness or self-obsession. And brands that fall into that category find it really, really difficult to build trust. So we keep our self-orientation score low by maintaining a sense of self while being present to our clients and our customers' needs. By checking in with our clients to see if our approach works for them. You know, it's interesting. People who enter any market tend to be very customer-centric. The customer's always right. We'll do anything to please them. The faster they grow, the bigger they get, the higher the self-orientation becomes, and the lower the needs and requirements of the customers become. You know, and so we hear companies saying, well, this is our product. This is how we work, like it or lump it. And ultimately, our flavor then becomes so diluted that our customers do say, well, okay, we'll lump it and we'll go and find someone who has a lower self-orientation and can actually meet our needs. So when we look at that trust equation, you know, we can, as a brand, as a business, as an individual, regularly conduct a bit of an audit on that and say, well, you know, where is my credibility at? What have I done to build it? How reliable am I? How intimate am I as a brand with my market and my customers? Can they get hold of me? And we can assign a score to each of them and then divide it by our self-orientation as the denominator and say, well, are we still really all about the customers, or is that just marketing speak? Does that reflect in our culture and in our behaviors? And this is a very powerful way that we can look at leadership, that we can look at brands, that we can look at marketing to see, you know, how trustworthy we are and how our customers really, whether they are the center of our universe or not.
Erik, this has been a genuinely fascinating chat. I feel like I have learned an incredible amount as a small business owner. A lot of this is super foundational to what we need to be doing. And I cannot wait to continue following you and learning more and more about just how to level up as a business owner. It's been incredible. That being said, if somebody would like to get a hold of you, maybe to chat about expeditions or in your capacity in leadership, how can they do so?
Very easy. I'm still old school, so email works best for me. Erik, ERIK, @ridgelineza.com. But of course, we are on LinkedIn as well, Erik Vermeulen, and the normal social media channels, Facebook and Instagram as Ridgeline_global.
And the links for everything will be in the description of this episode. If you've been thinking about starting a podcast but don't really know where to start, go to our website, baird.media. That's BAIRD.media. You can find the book, Become a Podmaster, everything you need to know to master the art of podcasting, and you can also sign up to one of our mentorship programs, where we help you figure out, develop, and produce your show from start to finish.